Good evening. The Commission on Human Rights is one of the breakthrough innovations of the 1987 post-Marcos Constitution. And now this important agency is awaiting the appointment of the sixth commission, a new set of 4 commissioners and 1 chair that will be appointed by the son of the ousted President Marcos. As people have learned to say these days, what could possibly go wrong? Tonight, let's talk about the fate and the future of the human rights agenda in the Philippines. I am John Nery, and you are in the public square. Earlier today, the news spread that the Securities and Exchange Commission had issued the final order to revoke Rappler's incorporation papers. This is a mistake, an injustice, an outrage, an attack on the freedom of the press in the ill-fitting guise of a regulatory technicality. We will fight this order to the fullest extent the law allows us. But this latest attack on the free press makes us even more sensitive to developments in the rights environment. After the second President Marcos takes his oath of office at noon tomorrow, what happens to the pursuit of the human rights agenda? Or more to the point, given the Marcos family's well-documented disregard for human rights, what happens to human rights, period? We are joined tonight by 2 lawyers, prominent human rights defenders. Attorney Ruben Carranza is a recognized international expert in transitional justice. Before he joined the International Center for Transitional Justice, he served, among other responsibilities, as a commissioner of the Presidential Commission on Good Government and an Assistant Secretary of National Defense. He joins us from New York. And since 2008, Attorney Jacqueline de Guia has worked at the Commission on Human Rights, serving by turns as a regional director, then spokesperson, then finally executive director, and today, caretaker-in-chief. Good morning, Attorney Ruben, and good evening, Attorney Jackie. Thank you for joining us today in the public square.
Good morning to you both.
Good evening, John, and hi to Attorney Ruben Carranza. It's a pleasure again to be on your show.
Again, thank you for making time. Maybe, Attorney Jackie, my first question is to you. Can you give us a situationer? You're the taong bahay of the CHR now. The fifth commission's term has lapsed, I think, as of May 5. What's happening in the CHR, and what are you hearing about possible new appointments?
Well, yes, John, the 7-year term of the Fifth Commission came to an end last May 5. And right now, we have our hands full. We continue to operate as we did in the past 35 years. We continue to address pressing human rights issues. During the last month, we did come out with our NICC report, and we also came out with our EJK report. We acted on several cases of national and local concerns. If you remember, there was the arrest of the Kinang 83 and some of the human rights defenders that we've had to attend to over the past few weeks. So pretty much, Jan, work continues at the CHR. We are very mindful that we have a constitutional mandate to carry out. And with that as our compass, it's easy to carry on the day-to-day operation of the CHR.
What have you been hearing about possible new commissioners? Can you share some of the names that are being floated?
Well, you know, John, since last year, with the untimely demise of former chairperson Chito, we've always been curious who was going to be appointed in CHR. We do hear that there are many applicants since last year up until now. We are hopeful that the government will be mindful of the Paris principles, and they will take into consideration the importance of an independent commission and bank, and of course We'd also like to highlight how important the characteristic of pluralism is very crucial for the next commission and bank. Uh, s- so far, many interesting names. The name of course, Secretary Catura has come up. So we just don't know if he's going to be the next chairperson of the CHR.
Secretary Natura of the Presidential Committee on Human Rights.
Yes, he's one of the more popular names that has been coming out recently.
Thank you. Attorney Ruben, you've been involved in various layers of the Philippine government, and also, of course, tangled with the Marcos family. What is your read on his appointments? Do you have any sense of where where these appointments will end up?
Well, he's a Marcos, and his family has used appointments in the government to ensure impunity and also to ensure that, in this case, Marcos Jr.'s case, to ensure that the narrative of the previous Marcos dictatorship, of the previous Marcos administration, uh, is changed. So many of the appointments are consistent with that goal. And many of the prospective appointments will, of course, try to also pursue the idea, the goal of legitimizing
Mhm.
the election of Marcos Jr. And I think that's one of the main concerns to look at. Uh, my sense is that Marcos Jr. is still anxious about the legitimacy of his election, and even if that now becomes uh, not necessarily a question that we can set aside, but with his inauguration, his official taking of the office of the president, there's still a question of legitimacy, so that hangs above his head in all of these appointments.
Yeah, it's taking me some time to wrap my head around the concept of a Marcos human rights agenda. Is there, in fact, in your view, Attorney Ruben, a human rights agenda under the second Marcos?
Well, um, Marcos Jr. carries two sets of human rights baggage. Of course, his own,
Mhm.
including the family's still unresolved obligations to victims of the human rights violations during the Marcos dictatorship. That's a financial obligation as well as a moral obligation, and of course, a legal obligation in the United States. But on
Mhm.
top of that, he carries the baggage of the Duterte administration's human rights violations, and the fact that Rodrigo Duterte, up to the very end, has tried to ensure his own impunity for those human rights violations. So, in effect, the human rights agenda of Marcos Jr.'s administration is to build the infrastructure for impunity. It's not a big challenge in that Rodrigo Duterte has already built the foundation for that. What Marcos Jr. wants to do is to ensure that that foundation covers his family as well and their obligations to victims of the human rights violations during the dictatorship. Going forward, I think would be one of the concerns because
Mhm.
he has also, I think, been trying to project an image of, like I said earlier, legitimacy. He is trying to appeal to Western governments, for example, to show that he is not a Duterte.
Mhm.
And many Western governments have prioritized human rights in their own foreign policy questions, and so it's a matter of how much room Marcos Jr. has to have a facade of respect for human rights on one hand, while
Mhm.
maintaining impunity for his family and for Rodrigo Duterte on the other.
Thank you. Attorney Jackie, I'm not going to ask you what you think of the appointment of Solicitor General Calida as COA chair, although um, I'm sure I'm not the only one with reservations, with grave reservations about the appointment. So I don't want to put you in that spot, but I do want to ask you, Uh, so right now it's the civil service that's maintaining the work of the Commission on Human Rights. Uh, how prepared are you to continue doing actual human rights work in case somebody like an attorney Larry Gadon is appointed commissioner? Larry Gadon, just to give an example, has said some very offensive things about our Muslim citizens, for instance, right? I mean, not exactly, exemplary behavior. Uh, would would the civil service component of the commission be in a position to continue doing actual human rights work, even though you may have political appointees like somebody like Gadon?
Yes, John, it's something that I think we've already demonstrated over time during the last 7 years, although it has been a very difficult environment politically and human rights wise. We did show that we are ready and we continue to stay faithful to the Constitution. And if there's one thing that we can be proud of in the Commission on Human Rights, as the rank and file would, is to how we have demonstrated our independence over the years. We've just celebrated 35 years of our existence, and one thing that is clear to us is how we should remain faithful to the Constitution and how clear that responsibility is. And with that, I think as our compass, it won't be that difficult navigating through the years to come.
Um, this is not to slight in any way the achievements of the late chair, Chito Gascon, who was a good friend of mine. But I think it was also because he was the chair that the commission was able to hurdle that crisis of the slashed budget. I think that Chito was able to convince Speaker Alvarez at the time and the others in Congress that it was the wrong decision. What I'm leading to is you had the commission had the help of the diplomatic skills of Chair Chito. What happened? Uh, uh, where else I'm looking for sources of strength or hope
Yeah.
in the
You
commission, in the
know,
civil service.
Chan,
Mhm.
yeah, it might be definitely true that to a large extent, Chito was a charismatic figure and he was instrumental in, for example, soliciting support politically and public wise. But the commission would have fallen short if it had not been able to deliver actual and concrete action over the years. And I think that's
Mhm.
what we were able to do during the past 6 years. Say, for example, on EJK alone, it wouldn't have been enough or sufficient had we just been talking about it. But I think what we have been able to manage to do over the past 6 years was to actually investigate real cases, and we were able to actually deliver good numbers. And that's what we've been able to do in other aspects of human rights as well. We've tackled many issues. We've delivered actual reports. We've spoken on a lot of issues. We've had a good communications arm. It was a balanced. It was a balanced perspective. We made sure that we were able to support critical human rights programs of the government, but also speak truth to power when necessary. That alone was not duly, I think, credited to Chito alone, but
Mhm.
to the strong 635 people of the commission who has strived to deliver actual results. It was overwhelming at first, the sheer number of cases that we had to attend to. But somewhere along the way, John, we were able to fully grasp what was the task ahead of us, and we were able to capacitate our people. We were able to rally our people to stand up to the challenges and to actually deliver. And
Mhm.
I think that's what will keep us through the following years, no? Because we've already proven to ourselves that we know what we have been formed for, the purpose that the commission has been created. That's very clear to us, and we now know how to deliver them, notwithstanding the different challenges.
Thank you. Attorney Ruben, in your experience working in other countries, has there ever been an instance of transitional justice where the transition circled back to uh, those who were formerly in power, and if you had that kind of experience,
Mhm.
what are the lessons to be drawn from that
Well, that's a
experience?
long discussion, John, but I'll give you two really short examples that are not exact because nothing is
Mhm.
ever the same
All right.
across different
Mhm.
countries. But um, a first example that would be familiar to many Filipinos is South Korea,
Mhm.
where the daughter of a former dictator was elected president many
Mhm.
years after her father uh, was removed from office. And the daughter ran on the basis of the same uh, platform to some extent of Marcos Jr. The
Mhm.
nostalgia for dictatorship, the idea that authoritarian rule is good for a country, and the argument that her father did many things for South Korea, uh, and she was elected president.
Mhm.
Against a more progressive candidate. But the same daughter did two things that Marcos Jr. did not do, and apparently will not do. First, she did apologize and acknowledge that her father committed human rights violations
Mhm.
during his dictatorship. It was not a very explicit apology, but an apology nonetheless, an acknowledgement nonetheless. The
Mhm.
other thing she did was to believe in uh, this cultish religious advisor that she had, and
Mhm.
commit corruption together with that person, and
Mhm.
eventually was impeached,
Mhm.
was tried and found guilty and imprisoned and then pardoned by her successor later on. The
Mhm.
other example that might actually be more familiar not to Filipinos but to the Marcoses themselves
Mhm.
is Morocco, where they went into exile. Amy Marcos stayed there with her family
Mhm.
under the protection of the former king uh, Hassan of Morocco. The son of King Hassan of Morocco actually created a truth commission after the death of his father. King Mohammed created a truth commission, and the truth commission examined the human rights legacy of his father. It went across the country, allowed people to speak and testify at public hearings of the Truth Commission, which came out with the report. And it was a Truth Commission that was whose membership consisted of human rights advocates and people respected in the human rights community, not just in Morocco, but internationally. And to a very large extent, it was seen as a credible truth commission, and it has had its impact on the Middle East and North Africa. So you
Mhm.
have you have these two examples where it is possible for a child of a dictator, for a child of an authoritarian ruler, to acknowledge the human rights violations committed by their parents, and
Mhm.
it is possible for the truth to come out, not to be hidden, not to be covered up with disinformation and with outright lies. Except that, of course, you have a different set of values among the Marcos family. The idea that they can lie their way through an election campaign, and perhaps the idea that they can lie their way through the next 6 years.
Um, Attorney Ruben, what would be uh, the litmus test? Wait, let me rephrase this. Um, so we're talking about the Commission on Human Rights, but you also served with the PCGG. What do you think is the possibility of President Marcos Jr. Uh, continuing to, because he's bound by law, to fund both the PCGG and the CHR, but uh, assigning them the task of running after human rights abuses of, political enemies, or, recovering assets of, political rivals. What's the possibility of that
Well, let
happening?
me say this explicitly. The Marcoses are more concerned with the accountability for corruption that they still have over their accountability for human rights violations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel that the Marcoses are confident, perhaps even overconfident, about how they may no longer be held accountable in the Philippines, in Philippine courts, for example, for human rights violations committed during the dictatorship, but are very frightened, still very anxious about their accountability for corruption. Having said that, I think they Marcos Jr., like I said earlier, will try to seek legitimacy, not necessarily in the eyes of Filipinos as far as he's concerned.
Mm-hmm.
His voters have been disinformed enough for him to no longer try to disinform them some more, but
Mm-hmm.
not Western eyes particularly, or even across the global South, not just Western countries, who still consider his family a corrupt family and consider the Marcos dictatorship an abusive dictatorship. So he will maintain the Commission of Human Rights. He might even try to use the Commission of Human Rights to shore up that quest for legitimacy. And one of the areas that I think he will try to do that in is in economic and social rights violations,
Mm-hmm.
which would be unfortunate to some extent, because there are, in fact, serious economic and social rights violations being committed in the Philippines that I think the Commission of Human Rights has uh, worked on and can continue to work on, but work on legitimately rather than as part of the agenda of a history falsifying Marcos family. On the other hand, the PCGG will be used by the Marcos family, and I think Marcos Jr. has all but said so, to go
Mm-hmm.
after former Marcos cronies that the Marcos family considers to still be possessing in control of assets that they claim are theirs. In other words, this will be a fight for ill-gotten wealth by the ill-getters of that wealth, not
Mm-hmm.
between those who want to recover it and return it to the people, but those who want to recover it and give it back to themselves.
This fight for the spoils. I remember that 1 week after Joseph Estrada took his oath, the Dincoanco took control of San Miguel Corporation, even though there was a pending, in fact, several pending lawsuits, and Andres Soriano III was still very much CEO. Um, Attorney Jackie, I'd like to pick up on something that Attorney Ruben reference, no, this information. I think we're all we're all, coming to terms now with the monster, the nightmare that is disinformation. um how has the Commission on Human Rights been addressing this problem of disinformation? You yourselves, as the Commission on Human Rights, you've been the target of disinformation campaigns. But of course, disinformation campaigns have also made your work more difficult. How are you addressing this? What are you doing to meet the problem of disinformation?
John, we did recognize that disinformation, misinformation, and the lack of information was really something that we needed to address back then, as early as 2016. If we do remember, there has been so much hostility, so much misconceptions, and so much misunderstanding about human rights, which I always found particularly absurd, only because it should make sense to us as humans. But the fact that we are so much against it, and we don't properly understand it, also shows how much the narrative has been controlled in the previous years. But there's also been a lot of misconception about the mandate of the CHR, which wasn't helpful, particularly in the first few years of the Fifth Commission. And it became very apparent to the CHR that we had to uh, consolidate our actions and resources to address this problem, we did create the Strategic Communications Division. I've handled it throughout the years. And one of our primary goals was to make sure that we were able to straighten the narrative about human rights, that we were able to seize it. Remember back then in 2016, people were hesitant to even use the term human rights. And we obstinately and stubbornly clung to that. We wanted to make sure that human rights wasn't going to be a term that would easily be forgotten, despite how unpopular it was at that time. And one of the things also that we've worked on was to make sure that the public clearly understood what the CHR was, what its mandate was all about, and for them to have a proper understanding that at the end of the day, human rights is primarily a state obligation. And then, of course, it was also very crucial for us to demonstrate impartiality. And while maintaining our strong stance against issues where we knew that we had to speak truth to power. And to do that, we had to come up with campaigns that reinforced and supported those policies and programs of the government that were basically human rights compliant, so that the public would properly understand the whole human rights issue. Because back then in 2016, people unfortunately equated human rights with EJKs, or the war on drugs, and that was very limiting for us. So we really had to make sure that our communications component was strengthened over the years. And of course, not only communications, but we also saw that on the long term, the real investment was to address the educational and promotional program of the Commission on Human Rights. So we did that also, especially during the last few years when we were able to adjust uh, to the protection mandate of the commission. Because, John, in the early years, there was no choice but to address the sheer number of cases that were being taken cognizance by the CHR. But through the latter years of the Fifth Commission, we did invest already on the education component of human rights, because we saw that it was really the root cause of many of the problems of the CHR and of the public in general.
My sense of uh, the narrative about the corruption and the human rights violations among the core Marcos voters is that these have been largely discounted. I mean, it's not necessarily that they don't think it exists, but it's discounted. I mean, they've come to terms with it. I think that's the problem. Attorney Jackie, can you speak of a specific one specific case each um, that's still pending, that's still continuing, that may have uh, that may have an adverse impact on the Marcoses. Can you, is there a specific human rights case now that maybe like a live one for the Marcoses, and that we need to pay a special attention to?
John, the CHR wasn't a party to any of the cases against the Marcoses in the past years, because our mandate was always to address current human rights violations. But we have to factor in, of course, that the HRVCB and the HRVCCM was
Mhm.
created back then in 2014. And these bodies were those primarily tasked to look into the human rights violations committed during the martial law era. And towards this, the HRVCB, which was attached to the CHR but is now defunct, was able to receive more than 70,000 cases, of which
Mhm.
11,000 were recognized as valid claims. And they were able to provide monetary compensation to this. And the HRVCCM exists up until now. It's been it's been mandated under the law to create a museum and a role of
Mhm.
victims for human rights victims who have been recognized by the HRVCB as valid claimants. So
Mhm.
basically, that's the relevance of the work of the CHR insofar as the martial law era is concerned.
What is the latest with the Human Rights Museum, Attorney Jackie? Some people think that it might be a flashpoint. I mean, budget might be withheld. Construction will push through. What is the status? What's the likelihood it'll turn into a flashpoint?
Well, it's going to be pretty much interesting to find out how the current administration will, of course, look at the HRVCCM. But right now, they're focused on building the museum. I understand that ED Crisanto is already looking into the construction of the building. A lot has been donated by the University of the Philippines,
Mhm.
where it can be constructed, and they're now in the initial phases, I think, of building it out. So we're anticipating how it will all play out in the next few years.
Yeah, so am I. We're running long, so maybe just one last question for Attorney Ruben. Attorney Ruben, again, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of the Marcoses and a human rights agenda under the Marcoses. Can you help us think through, no? In the next 6 years, how should we think of the human rights agenda under the Marcoses? What should we look out for? What should we do?
Well, it's important to remember the basic functions of human rights advocacy, and Jackie will, of course, know this: protection, fulfillment, promotion. Uh, Protect human rights, fulfill human rights. And I think it's important to look at the protection position as not just protecting people from human rights violations, but protecting people from accepting that human rights violations are normal. That's what Rodrigo Duterte did, and that's important to remember that going forward under Marcos Jr. But fulfillment is also important, and I mentioned economic and social rights, because fulfilling social rights, economic rights, the right to health, the right to food, the right to live in a home are just as important, and I think that goes hand in hand with equality. And when we have a Marcos family stealing $10 billion from their own people, it's obvious that equality will not be the priority of the Marcos administration. So it's very important not to forget economic and social rights violations, the idea that human rights are meant to recognize equality, and that the Philippines not only is an unequal society, but now under Marcos Jr. will become an even more unequal society.
Is it, sorry, one last question. Is it possible for the CHR, to continue to do actual human rights work and make an impact on human rights advocacies, even though the Marcoses will not apologize, will continue to avoid their own personal and family responsibilities?
I
Uh,
think it's even more necessary for the CHR to do that, John.
okay. On that note, Attorney Jacqueline de Guia, Executive Director of the CHR, and Attorney Ruben Carranza, Senior Expert for Programs at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Thank you very much for your time, your insights, and for your work defending the public square. Thank you.
Salamat.
Thank you very much.
That's it for us tonight. The next step for engaged citizens is always to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.